Hey Mark, how are you today?
Good, very good.
Good, good.
In spite of
So
how bad the world is.
yeah, I know. So say I was looking at some of the recent work that you and Anik are doing and some of the conversation around peace finance, and we've had a running conversation in the lab about the power of data,
Mhm.
right? And certainly that's something that's really come to the fore. It's been a discussion point for the last decade in corporations in terms of the power of big data in the
Mhm.
early 2010s. Certainly, I was certainly part of those conversations with Deloitte and Aspen Institute and things like that. And then there was the promise of big data, right? And then toward the middle of the 2010s, 2015, 2016, 2017, we also then began to see the danger of big data in terms of surveillance and loss of privacy. And now, with current events and all that, and certainly what we've been talking about in the lab, is how we can use data for good. Um, and then concurrent with that is the power of finance and startups and the power of business to help people be good to each other, right? And I think one of the big game changers, certainly in business, is data analytics, right? We didn't 20 years ago we didn't think about customer lifetime value, and certainly for a lot of small businesses they didn't have any data insights about their business. You might have like very gross numbers in terms of your accounting system. You could see your revenues, expenses, things like that. But to really understand, well, wow, where's most of my business coming from which customers, and thinking about how do I might, depending upon the scale of my business, I might have an intuition about who my repeat customers are,
Yeah,
but nothing to really dig into. And there's an interesting
right.
opportunity here, right?
Indeed, indeed. And there's a little bit more to the backstory because, of course, we come out of the persuasive tech lab at Stanford, and so BJ started really paying attention to data and big data all the way back, sort of the end of the '90s and the beginning of the 2000s, because he was sort of viscerally aware that in order to build persuasive tech, what it thrives on is, I mean, the input you need is data. You need
Yeah.
behavior data in order to see who's doing what when, so that you can reinforce those behaviors, basically. So and um, and for anybody who's freaked out about hearing that bit of what we're doing, BJ was very focused on um, how does technology augment our ability to become more the kind of people we want to be. And his focus partly was coming out of an awareness that big governments and big industry was going to be using the same kind of data to either make people be good citizens, which means sit down, shut up, do what you're told, or good customers, which means buy more crap you don't need.
Hmm.
And so way back when he was writing his dissertation, he already started thinking about how does he push back on that future? And could we use this stuff for good? Is there some way we could use it for good, right? And
Yeah.
so my aha around big data started with the my failed economic experiment that led to a new way of measuring peace and going, oh,
Right.
well, that could be super interesting, right? I started understanding what BJ was doing and where he was coming from and why he was so worried about the direction things were going and why he was trying to build an alternate future by democratizing persuasive tech. It
Right.
wasn't until then that I really understood why behavior data and why big data in general as an engine of analysis and an engine of knowledge creation, and why big behavior data in particular massively matters for society,
Right.
especially if you
So,
want to create positive outcomes. Yeah.
so the thing that pops into my head is the ethical capitalist, and I don't know why. Okay, so um, there's a book called The Ethical Slut, right? Which is kind of an interesting thing, all independent of it. And I thought, oh, the ethical slut, the ethical capitalist, right? This notion of something that might seem a little bit dodgy, and say, well,
Yeah.
how would you do this practice in an ethical way? And especially today, given capitalism and its discontents, right?
Yeah.
How would you be an ethical capitalist? How would you be an ethical financier? And how would you use this data with the intentionality of it's by looking at this data, I can examine how I can be a more ethical, a financier or a capitalist that enhances the public good, right? And I have the data that shows me how I can do that, because of course, obviously there needs to be profit, because it needs to be sustainable. If you can't make money, it ends, right? And all the people who are unemployed, they are feeling that very viscerally. So how can we, by looking at the data that we generate, or that we co-generate with our customers and our partners and our collaborators, where can we find the opportunities to create more value in a sustainable, ethical, positive way? And that is pretty exciting, to look at all this data in that way, right?
Exactly, exactly. You know, when I first saw your profile on LinkedIn the very first time, and you build yourself as a mental capitalist, that resonated deeply with me, because I have described myself in some other places as a compassionate capitalist. And so, and for me, compassion and beauty are probably, in general, more fertile approaches to ethics than aiming at ethics themselves. And we'll have a whole other conversation about stepping stone algorithms and creativity and innovation in some other talk here. Mm-hmm. Yes, we can recognize that, okay, this is a really powerful tool.
Right.
Finance is a super powerful tool. Capital is a super powerful tool. And we can also recognize a couple other things. You know, we didn't invent capital. And I mean, our species didn't. Humans did not invent capital. Humans did not invent markets. Humans did not invent economies. Mm-hmm. You know, other species have been doing things since long before we were on the planet. We have tweaked them and done our own versions of them. But essentially, you can see, if you look at the world, at markets, at business, at profit, at caring for each other, right, through our perspective, what you see is, if we were a species 300 years ago, 400 years ago, that was actually asking the question, how can we care for each other better? Mm-hmm. The best answer we've come up with for that in the last 400 years is markets. And a market is just a large parallel human-powered computer network that is a computation system for computing who needs what, where, when, why, how much.
When it's functional. But when it's dysfunctional, it doesn't do that. I mean, it does it, but it's extractive and exploitative.
We're going there. No, it isn't. That's
always,
like saying,
but often.
No, wait. You're leading people down a really bad garden path there. It's not a case of when it works versus when it doesn't. It's a case of when you give it accurate data versus when you don't. Okay, and that's no different than any other human network, when you tell people the truth versus when you lie to them. Okay, and so that's what makes a market functional or dysfunctional. Yeah.
Okay, so when we think about when a double ledger accounting was invented, I think it was during the Renaissance, in Italy. They came up with an accounting system, right? They came up with an accounting, and obviously the Sumerians and the Egyptians and everyone had, ways to tabulate, stores of grain and jars of oil and all that stuff.
The double ledger thing was enabled trade networks, because
yes, exactly.
You didn't have to actually move assets. You could move information. Right. Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So you have these two sets of books, and you go the ins and the outs, the inputs and the outputs, right? And they have to balance. But of course, think about the technology that's available during the Renaissance and what you can measure. I can measure tangible things. I got 10 of these and I got 4 of those, and I look in the room, the storeroom, and I write it down, voila, right? The things that I can't measure, how do I measure the value of a relationship? How do I measure the value of clean water or clean air when I don't even have a germ theory of disease, right? How do I measure these things that are intangible? Because I can't put them in a box in a storeroom, right? Yep. So guess what? The accounting system says, we'll worry about that later. In the meantime, I mean, they call them bean counters for a reason, right? And so now, and the Renaissance was 500 years ago, right? So half a millennium later, we're still using this system to count what's valuable. And there have been a lot of people who've been working on how do we cost, and how do we assign a cost to negative externalities, but how do we assign a value to these externalities of air, water, relationships, peace, health. You know, if you're healthy and you're just sitting there and I go, I'm breathing in and out and I don't have to go to the doctor, so I am healthy. How do we assign a value to that, right? We don't. We
Yeah.
don't have to do that. We can only assign when there's a cost. Like if there's a hard cost to you, like I got sick, I have to go to the doctor, that's money that you paid. That's really easy to measure. And so now we're getting into this whole realm of how do we do these things that are a little bit amorphous. And what's interesting is the data revolution is actually giving us an ability to do that, right? It's giving us the
Exactly.
ability to assign a cost. We can actually now assign a cost to what happens if you don't manage a pandemic well. It's in the trillions of
Yes.
dollars. It's like, okay,
Yeah,
look,
exactly.
if you don't do the planning, if you're not too proactive, if you don't do contact tracing immediately, if you don't do these things immediately, this is what the cost is. Before it was an abstraction. It's like, well, you know, will it, will not? I don't know, prove it. Now we have empirical data, right?
Yeah.
And that, and it's concrete. The data is concrete. You can actually track those numbers. And of course, engineers and finance people love numbers. And that's
And that
the
takes
big
us
thing.
to, right, that it allows us to start shifting from episodes of engagement, transactions and interactions, you know, to then going, okay, we can model a relationship between two entities in terms of the ongoing aggregation of those episodes of engagement, those interactions, right? We can look at those interactions over time and get a sense of, is this getting stronger or weaker? Is it healthy? Is it unhealthy, et cetera? And then when you have enough data to understand that relationship really well, at some point you can look up from the transaction to the relationship to the person on the other side of it, or to the entity on the other side, to the species on the other side, because we have all sorts of economic engagements with other species, right?
Oh yeah,
And at some point
absolutely.
you can look all the way up to the other, and you can start going, oh, you are the reason I'm able to receive this value. And so instead of just investing in the transaction, or one step better, investing in the relationship, now I can start investing in you as well.
Right.
And it's at that point that you've got the beginning of something really ethical as well,
Yeah.
because it's not only sustainable, it's potentially scalable. And then you
Right.
can take that new value and put it into also rebalancing other relationships, getting to that third order effect in other relationships as well. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And so ethics in action, right?
Yeah.
It is ethics. It doesn't have to be something that's stuck in a college philosophy class, and we go like, well, what do these philosophers and these philosophers, and you know, they're all the different schools of thought around utilitarian ethics versus this ethics versus that ethics. You can operationalize that.
And it
It can
allows
be
us to also
expressed in
get
action.
computational on it in the sense of, you know, we can really begin to measure, we can begin to do different ethical kinds of experiments to try and test which kind of ethical approaches work better for who, for what, for when, for where. Because thinking that there is a single recipe that works all the time for everything is a conceit of a shortage of computation power. But you know,
Well, I
we
mean, if
don't have that kind of monocropping
right, but
of
certainly
other
if you
kinds of
get
ideas
it,
anywhere in the world.
but if you get up high enough to a level of abstraction, there is a concept, a universal concept, and but it's how you localize it, right? How you
Right,
do it
it's
in
how
the
you localize
particular.
it, exactly.
It's in the
You know,
particular.
as the child of wonderful parents who were doing the best that they could with what they knew, to have a positive impact in the world, and we're missionaries. I'm sort of super sensitive to the idea of, we have this one size fits all way of making your life better,
Mm.
even though we don't know you.
And so coming from a Catholic tradition, and of course the Jesuits have this thing. What is it called? And when they look at the particular,
Malcolm Gladwell wrote about that.
right? He did a podcast about it. Casuistry.
Casuistry.
Casuistry. Yes, yes, yes. It's a method of moral reasoning pioneered by Jesuit thinkers, right? So when
And
you're
it
in
was
this
basically
conundrum,
an ancient or older version of the modern process that every company has to do when they go into a global market, and they have to localize their product to make sure, does our product that works so well over here, does it actually serve these people over here who are different?
right?
And you find out that almost certainly No, it won't right off the shelf from your previous market. Almost certainly you have to change some things in order for it to land better in this new market, right?
Right.
So, and
But
that's a good
it's
thing.
still, yeah, but it's still dealing with this moral, I'm still looking for this moral outcome. And I can't get bollocks up over the
Yes.
particular details of it. I can't be pedantic about it. It's like, all right, I got to tweak this, but I'm still getting the big picture moral
Well,
outcome.
the big picture is, how do I actually care for this customer better and not fall into the trap of thinking, well, this customer is just like all the other customers, and customers are all one size fits all, and I don't have to personalize anything. I don't have to pay attention to them. I don't have to get to know them.
Right.
I can just treat them as the average of a category, you know?
Right.
And
But this is also, I mean, this is where, like, certainly in the last 25, 30 years, where we've had big leaps in this in terms of design thinking, right? Design thinking is getting human centered, or even the advent of UX, UI, and software. Or back in the day, coders would tell their customers if they didn't understand them, it was RTFM, read the freaking
yeah,
manual, right? And so it was like, I'm not gonna tailor something to you or try to understand you or try to make this easier for you. It's like my way or the highway, right?
right,
Which is
right.
very arrant. And if you
Truth be
want to be
told,
good,
yeah,
right? And if you want to be good to someone, you don't say it's my way or the highway, or I've designed it perfectly. And if you don't understand it, it's because you're dumb. But saying like,
right,
oh, I need to, I mean, this is compassion in action. This is empathy in action, saying like, oh, I need to design the user experience so that you can be successful. And so as soon as we have that shift in mindset from I'm
yeah,
brilliant and if you don't get it, you're dumb, to how can I design this so you can be successful
exactly,
in the thing that
exactly.
you're trying to do, that's a huge leap forward in empathy,
Yeah,
compassion, and being good to the person, because you're actually thinking, you're designing with them in mind. They are at the center of it. And
yeah.
we are of service to help them in their goals.
To underscore and build on, one of your key points there about that is the compassionate thing to do. That's the compassionate thing for the designer to do for himself as well, because
Mhm.
you're going to have a much happier relationship with your client, and you will make more money, and you will have better places to invest that money if you do it that way. If you tilt towards authoritarianism and you have that do it my way because I said and because I'm the boss or whatever, you will have, if you'll have to maintain your relationship with your user by coercion, by force, by trickery, by some means that won't be fun for either of you, and then you'll
It's
have to keep
exhausting.
policing that. And right, it generates so much friction for you, even as the supposed person in power, that it ain't worth it. It ain't
Yeah.
worth it.
I mean,
And
who
there's
wants
so
to
much
live in a
better ways.
bunker, right?
Right, exactly.
I mean,
Yeah,
and so like, oh, really? Is that the future that you were hoping for yourself? Is that your future would be that you'd have to hide from your people? No.
right. Yeah,
I mean,
and who
but
wants to live in a
yeah. So there is an easier, better way that's better for all concerned, right? And so to me,
and better for you too? Yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah. Better for all the
how.
stakeholders.
So when people are thinking about what can I do that's concrete, that's how you operationalize this, right? And
Yes,
it's and it's
exactly,
and it's
exactly.
also recognizing that the things that you're already doing, when you say I want to be customer focused, or I want to be human focused in my design, or I want to be service oriented, just having that orientation is how you operationalize empathy for the other, right? And it is how
Exactly.
you
Exactly.
see that other person and how that person feels seen, heard, and understood. And those behaviors, if we do them consistently in all our practices, are the things that will reshape the world.
Exactly.
And it will
Exactly. And
reshape
to
it
your,
so that we feel like our needs are met and we're respected and we're seen as
yes.
human.
And to your point yesterday, to your super important point yesterday, not just seen, heard, understood, valued, deeply
Right,
valued.
right.
And this actually takes us full circle back to big data again as well, because the thing that was the scarce resources as people were trying to build products for global markets and so on 20, 30, 40 years ago, the thing that was the scarce resource was computation. And so
Mhm.
even if you had the data about that customer transaction, you could not process it to really deeply understand the relationship at anything like the degree you can today
Mhm.
easily,
Right.
and we lived through this transaction or this transition, Margarita, where we noticed in 2008 or so that there were free analytics tools from Google and other platforms that were free, that were more powerful than anything the CIA had,
Mhm.
or any other intelligence agency on the planet at the time,
Mhm.
pre-Palantir, so, the and and that was a remarkable shift in power and a remarkable shift in democratization that hey,
Yeah.
by enabling people in the marketplace to start applying these kinds of analytics engines to understand, first of all, the transaction, you know, can you even do the transaction? But then second of all, the relationship, because if you have gone to all the trouble to invent a new product and get it to market, and you finally got your first customer, if you spent all that money, and you know, you and I know this from the finance side, venture capital and investment banking side, if you've gone to all that trouble to finally find that, your very next question is, oh my God, I hope this can be repeated. I hope this is sustainable, right? And so you go from the transaction to the relationship. Now we have enough data and we've got the analytics engines to really start understanding the other, who each individual customer is, and customizing this kind of stuff for each individual customer.
So the opportunity, if we're going to be the ethical capitalist or the ethical entrepreneur or the ethical financier, is to, or the ethical AI, you know, innovator.
Anybody who's using this data for whatever.
Anyway, right? Because there's always issues of bias, of things that are hidden. If we're thinking from an ethical standpoint and a starting position of, I want to be of service, right? And I want to help you realize your goals, right? So the prime directives of how good can we be to each other, then we can be vigilant when we're not. Because we're always comparing against that. That's our standard. And it's like, okay, are we being good to you? Oh, is there bias? Okay, we need to root out the bias. What are the hidden assumptions? We need to make them explicit. We know, certainly in this day and age, there's no question, there's a lot of bias in our systems and our institutions, right? It's hidden, it's for whatever historical reason. I'm not going to go shame and blame anyone, but say, let's surface it and give it sunlight. And then when we do that, say, here we go, here, and here. This is the data that shows us the weak signal of bias. Great, now we can fix it.
Now we can do something about it.
Now we can do something about it.
And now we can measure in the data, does our intervention work or not?
Right.
Because there's all sorts of interventions that sound like they should work, but they don't.
But they don't. Right. And but part of it is dealing with the discomfort of what the data shows. And I think right now what's happening in society is that we're all having these really, really difficult conversations, because as often happens when people are giving that weak signal of, you're doing harm for me, and they're doing it politely and they're doing it peaceably, and they're saying, please, I want you to listen, this is hurting me, and they're just tuning it out, or whatever the thing is. I'm not hearing you because it's not urgent, because I'm busy doing other things. And it's almost like I have to get up in your face to say, this is really important. I have to shake you by the shoulders. I have to do something to get your attention, to make it urgent and now. So there's something about time as well. But if we could be more proactive, if we could be, like, as Dan Heath says, look upstream.
Right.
Be proactive and look upstream and look at the data and go, oh, wait a minute, this is an issue, especially because some of these complex issues are not in a single silo. They're not in a single department. You have to get meta and look at the system and say, okay, it's actually technically not my job. It's not technically anybody's job to monitor this, but how can we collectively do that so we can come together to come up with solutions? And that, I think, is the grand challenge right now, is how do we get out of our silos to say, even though it's not in my job description to solve this, if I see it, what are the things that we need to put in the environment so that people are empowered to actually come up with solutions? And that's the grand challenge that we have right now, and data can help us with that. But the other is, how do we organize and break across those silos?
We've seen two encouraging trends in the last 5 years that you and I have kind of gone through as we've been building up this concept of peace data and frameworks for peace data and so on. In both the case of Airbnb and the case of Uber, when people started seeing, oh, there's different kinds of bias on our platform. And the encouraging trend is, because they have the data, the moment somebody says, I think there might be bias, somebody in that company can go, let's run the data and see.
Right.
And then as you talk about getting proactive about that, you can start, and we haven't seen them doing this yet, at least in those companies, but people in other companies are starting to get, proactive. How would we filter for this kind of thing in advance so that we can address it before it becomes a problem? But the encouraging sign that we did see in both of those cases was the moment the data showed, yes, this really is an issue, there's no way for the board of directors to unsee that. And the board of directors has a legal liability, and at that point they're like, okay, we have to address this some way or other, and it's a business issue. It's affecting our business, and so our shareholders will sue us if we don't address this because it affects our profits.
So the interesting thing about Airbnb, when they looked at the bias and said, oh, we need to do this, they said, okay, we're going to implement anti-bias training among all our hosts across all these countries, right? And those hosts have to take a pledge. Interestingly enough, 1.3 million of them declined to take the pledge. And Airbnb removed them from the platform. It's like, if you can't agree to this, we don't want you on our platform. And that's pretty bold to say, you know what? That's not what we stand for. If you don't stand for what we stand for in terms of our values, we can't do business with you. Love you, move on. And that's powerful. That is really, really powerful. But they had the data, they had the analytics, they did an intervention, they could measure it. And for those who did not want to do the intervention, who did not want to be a better version of themselves, they said, okay, as the ethical capitalists, they say, we're gonna move you on. there's not a place for you here.
Right, it creates a really nice alignment. And it creates a really nice alignment of both ethics, and one of the reasons we call it ethics is because it's about what ultimately actually works. And in that sense, that's why we care about this stuff. It's not just doing the right thing and then you're dead. It's like, the reason we call it the right thing is because it is the thing that ultimately actually works for more stakeholders over more time, right? And so they could do the cost benefit analysis, and they could say, it is worth giving up this 1.3 million customers now in order to have the kind of brand and the kind of platform and so on that we want later. We can see that it's worth it. We can make that decision and go, we can go look our shareholders in the eye and say, this is a better investment for you.
Absolutely. And with that, I think that's a great way to close this conversation.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Mark.